The colony ship Perseverance drifted through the cold darkness of space like a wounded animal waiting to die. Her engines had failed 17 hours ago, and the backup systems had followed shortly after, leaving 12,000 human souls floating in the emptiness between stars with nothing but emergency power keeping them alive. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood on the bridge and watched the oxygen timer count down on the flickering display screen. They had maybe 4 days left if they were lucky. Humanity had only been traveling among the stars for 2 centuries at this point, and they were still considered primitives by the rest of the galaxy. The great powers of known space barely acknowledged their existence, and the minor species avoided them out of fear of association. When you were new to the cosmic neighborhood, nobody wanted to be your friend. The distress beacon had been broadcasting for 16 hours now, and Sarah had received exactly 0 responses. She was not surprised out here in the outer reach, far from the major trade routes and the protected zones of the great empires. A dying ship was just another piece of debris. The strong survived and the weak perished, and that was simply how the universe worked. At least that was what the galaxy believed. Sarah looked out at the stars and thought about the children sleeping in the lower decks. The families who had sold everything they owned to start a new life on a distant world. The dreams that would die with them in this frozen tomb. She had accepted her own death hours ago, but she could not accept theirs. The sensor officer made a sound that Sarah had never heard before, and she turned to see the young woman staring at her console with wide eyes. "Captain, I am detecting ships, a convoy of some kind, bearing directly toward us at high speed." Sarah felt her heart skip, and then immediately forced herself to stay calm. Ships in the outer reach could mean many things, and most of them were not good pirates. Would strip them for parts and leave them to suffocate. Slavers would take the young and healthy and space the rest. And even legitimate traders would likely demand payment they could not provide. "Can you identify them?" she asked. The sensor officer worked her console for a long moment before looking up with confusion on her face. "The Luxy merchant vessels?" "Captain, 7 of them. They appear to be a trade convoy heading toward hegemony space." Sarah felt her confusion match the officer's expression. The Veluxi were a minor species of traders and craftsmen who inhabited a small cluster of 11 worlds. On the far side of the galaxy, they were known for their honesty in business dealings and their skill at manufacturing precision instruments, but they had no military power and no political influence. They were exactly the kind of species that survived by keeping their heads down and avoiding trouble. Why would they change course for a dying human ship when doing so could cost them everything? The answer came 3 hours later when the Veluxi convoy surrounded the Perseverance and their lead ship made contact. The face that appeared on the view screen was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. The Veluxi had smooth gray skin and large, dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom, and their mouths were small but expressive, curving into what Sarah somehow recognized as a gentle smile. "I am Merchant Captain Yevon of the trade vessel Gentle Current," the alien said through the universal translator. "We received your distress signal and have come to offer assistance." Sarah stared at him for a long moment, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Merchant Captain, I must be honest with you. We have nothing to offer in payment. Our cargo is agricultural equipment and personal belongings, nothing of value to your people." Yevon made a gesture that Sarah would later learn was the Veluxi equivalent of a dismissive. "I did not ask about payment, Captain. I asked if you needed assistance, and clearly you do. So let us discuss what can be done. Over the next 17 days, the Veluxi convoy towed the Perseverance to the nearest human outpost. They shared their own food and water rations. When the human supplies ran low, they opened their ships to human families so children could sleep in warm beds instead of cold emergency shelters. They even detoured to a Veluxi trading station to acquire medicine when a fever swept through the human passengers. It cost them everything. The hegemony find. Yevon's convoy for their late arrival and revoked his trading license for the next 5 cycles. His crew lost their bonus payments, and several of them faced financial ruin. The other Veluxi captains faced similar penalties and the whispered disapproval of their own people, who thought they had been foolish to risk so much for strangers. When the Perseverance finally reached safe harbor, Sarah Mitchell sought out Merchant Captain Yevon before he departed. She found him supervising the transfer of the last human passengers to the station, and she approached him with tears streaming down her face. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you do this for us when it cost you so much?" Yevon turned those large, dark eyes upon her, and she saw something in them that she would never forget. A kindness so pure and unconditional that it seemed almost alien in a galaxy ruled by self-interest. "We are all travelers in the void," he said quietly. "Today you needed shelter, and so we provided it. Tomorrow perhaps we will need shelter, and someone will provide it for us. This is the way of decent beings, is it not?" Sarah had no words. She simply took his gray hand in both of hers and held it tight. "I will never forget this," she whispered. "My people will never forget this. I swear it on my life." Yevon smiled again and gently freed his hand. "There is no debt between us, Captain. There is only the knowledge that we did what was right. That is payment enough." He returned to his ship, and the Veluxi convoy departed, and Sarah Mitchell watched them go until they vanished into the starlight. True to her word, she never forgot. She carved Yevon's name into the memorial wall of New Providence Colony when it was finally established 3 years later. She told his story to anyone who would listen. She taught her children and her grandchildren about the gray-skinned merchant who had sacrificed everything to save strangers he had never met. And humanity as a whole listened and learned and remembered in the decades that followed. As mankind spread further into the galaxy and grew stronger with each passing year, they made a point of learning everything they could about the Veluxi. They studied their culture and their language and their history. They memorized the locations of their 11 worlds and the names of their leaders. They watched over them from a distance like silent guardians, never interfering but always aware. The Veluxi never knew they were being watched. The galaxy never suspected that humanity was keeping track, but they were, because mankind never overlooks a favor, and the universe was about to learn exactly what that meant. 150 years had passed since the rescue of the Perseverance, and the galaxy had changed in many ways. The hegemony had grown stronger, swallowing smaller civilizations and expanding their borders with the slow inevitability of a rising tide. The other great powers had retreated into careful neutrality, unwilling to challenge the dominant force of known space, and the Veluxi had remained exactly what they had always been, a minor species of traders and craftsmen, too small to threaten anyone and too insignificant to protect Merchant Captain Yevon was now Elder Yevon. His gray skin wrinkled with age and his large dark eyes dimmed by the weight of many decades. He had retired from trading long ago, and now spent his days teaching young Veluxi the ways of honest commerce and decent behavior. He rarely thought about the human ship he had rescued. All those years ago it had been the right thing to do, and that was enough. He did not expect gratitude or reward. He did not expect anything at all when the hegemony's third expansion, Amada, appeared in the skies above Veluxi Prime. Elder Yevon understood immediately what was happening. The hegemony had finally noticed that the Veluxi cluster sat upon rich deposits of rare minerals and strategic resources. They had finally decided that primitive merchants had no right to keep such valuable territory. 400 capital ships filled the space around the Veluxi homeworld like a swarm of metal predators. Each one was larger than anything the Veluxi could hope to build, and armed with weapons that could crack a planet open like an egg. The Veluxi had no fleet to speak of. Their entire military consisted of a handful of patrol craft designed to chase away pirates. Not warships capable of standing against an armada. They had no allies who would risk war with the hegemony to save them. They had no hope at all. Hegemony Admiral broadcast his demands across all frequencies with the bored confidence of someone who had done this many times before the Veluxi would surrender their worlds immediately and submit to hegemony. Rule those who cooperated would be relocated to designated work colonies. Those who resisted would be destroyed. There would be no negotiation and no appeal. Elder Yevon sat in his small home and listened to the broadcast and felt something he had not felt in many years. Fear. Not for himself, for he was old and had lived a good life, but for his people, for the children who would grow up as slaves if they grew up at all, for the culture and history and traditions that would be erased as if they had never existed. Thought about running, but there was nowhere to run. He thought about fighting, but there was nothing to fight within the end. He did the only thing he could do. He went to the communications center and sent out a desperate transmission on every frequency he could reach, begging anyone who might be listening for help. He did not expect an answer. The galaxy had rules, unspoken but understood by everyone who traveled to stars. Small species did not challenge the hegemony. Other powers maintained careful neutrality. Intervention meant war, and war with the hegemony meant annihilation. No one would come, no one would risk everything for a minor species of merchants and craftsmen. Elder Yevon sent his message anyway, because doing nothing felt like giving up, and he had never learned how to give up for 6 days. The Veluxi prepared for extinction. Families gathered together in their homes and held each other close. Historians worked frantically to archive their records and send copies to distant servers in the hope that some fragment of their culture might survive. Religious leaders offered prayers and comfort to those who sought it. Children asked their parents why the sky was full of monsters, and the parents had no answers to give. Elder Yevon spent those days walking through the streets of the capital city, talking to anyone who would listen, trying to offer hope where there was none. He told stories of his trading days, of the wonders he had seen among the stars, of the basic goodness that existed in some beings, despite the cruelty of the universe. He did not mention the human ship. It seemed so long ago now, so distant and unimportant compared to the doom that hung above them on the 7th day. The hegemony admiral announced that time had run out. The Veluxi had failed to surrender, and so they would face the consequences. The bombardment would begin at noon and continue until every city on the planet was reduced to ash. Elder Yevon stood on his balcony and watched the sun rise for what he believed would be the last time. He thought about his life and decided that he had no regrets. He had been a decent being who had tried to help others when he could. That was enough. That had to be enough. At precisely 1 hour before noon, the sky changed. Elder Yevon felt it before he saw it, a strange ripple in the fabric of space that made his old bones ache. Then the stars began to multiply. Ships appeared out of nowhere, dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation. More ships than Elder Yevon had ever seen in one place. They were sleek and angular and painted in colors he did not recognize. Silver and blue and a deep crimson that seemed to glow with inner fire. They surrounded the Veluxi homeworld in a protective shell, positioning themselves between the planet and the hegemony armada for a long moment. The universe held its breath. Then a broadcast cut through all frequencies, overriding even the hegemony's communication systems with ease. The voice that spoke was female and human, and it carried an authority that made Elder Yevon's hearts skip. This is Admiral Chun of the United Earth Confederacy flagship Perseverance 2. The Veluxi are under humanity's protection. You have 1 hour to withdraw your forces from this system. There will be no second warning. There will be no negotiation. Elder Yevon stared at the sky and felt tears streaming down his face, whispered the name of his old ship, the gentle current, and thought about a human woman who had promised that her people would never forget. The hegemony admiral responded. With laughter and contempt, humanity was a minor power with perhaps 50 systems and a modest defense force. They were primitives who had barely learned to travel between stars. The idea that they could challenge the hegemony was absurd. He ordered his fleet to attack the human ships and destroy them as an example to anyone else who might think of interfering. He gave the order with absolute confidence. He stopped laughing 30 seconds later, when the first wave of his ships began to explode. The Battle of Veluxi Prime would be remembered for 1,000 years as the moment the galaxy learned to fear humanity. It began with fire and chaos as the hegemony fleet surged forward, confident in their superior numbers and ancient technology. 400 capital ships against 1,200 human vessels should have been a manageable fight for the hegemony. They had won against worse odds before they had conquered 1,000 worlds with fleets like this one, but they had never fought humans before, and they did not understand what that meant. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Perseverance II and watched the enemy ships approach. With calm eyes, her grandmother had been a child aboard the original Perseverance, sleeping in a Veluxi bunk while merchant captain Yevon shared his rations with human strangers. Her mother had grown up hearing stories about the gray-skinned traders who had saved them when no one else would, and Chun herself had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, building a fleet in secret, developing weapons that no one knew existed, waiting for the day when humanity could finally repay its oldest debt. All ships, she said quietly, engage at will. The human fleet moved like a single organism, each ship knowing exactly where to be and what to do. They were faster than the hegemony vessels, their engines designed by engineers who had studied every flaw in alien technology and improved upon it. They were tougher than anyone expected, their hulls reinforced with materials the hegemony had never encountered, and their weapons hit harder than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The first wave of hegemony ships vanished in balls of plasma fire before they could even return fire. The second wave managed to launch missiles, but the human point defense systems swatted them out of the sky like insects. The third wave tried to flank the human formation, but found themselves caught in a crossfire that turned their ships into expanding clouds of debris. Admiral Chun watched the battle unfold on her tactical display and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. 150 years ago, her ancestors had drifted helpless in the void, waiting to die. Today, humanity was the one doing the killing. The hegemony admiral realized his mistake within the first hour, but by then it was already too late. He tried to regroup his forces into a defensive formation, but the humans gave him no time to recover. They pressed the attack relentlessly, cutting through his fleet with surgical precision, targeting command ships and supply vessels and communication relays. By the third hour, the hegemony fleet was in full retreat, trying desperately to reach the edge of the system and escape into hyperspace. The humans did not let them go easily. Every ship that tried to run had to fight through a gauntlet of human warships that seemed to be everywhere at once. Every captain who thought they had found an escape route discovered too late that it was a trap. By the 6th hour, half the hegemony fleet was gone, destroyed or disabled or drifting without power. The admiral's flagship was damaged and burning, its proud banners torn and its weapons silent. He sent out a surrender signal on all frequencies, begging for mercy, offering any terms the humans wanted. Admiral Chun listened to his pleas and felt her grandmother's voice whispering in her ear, telling her about the Veluxi merchant who had asked for Nothing in return for saving 12,000 lives. She opened a channel to the enemy flagship and spoke in a voice that carried no emotion at all. You came to this system to exterminate a people who showed humanity kindness when we had nothing to offer in return. You came to take their worlds and scatter their children and erase their memory from the stars. You do not get to surrender. The Hegemony Admiral began to protest, but Chun cut him off. You get to run. You get to take whatever ships you have left and flee back to your masters and tell them what happened here. Tell them that the Veluxi are under humanity's protection now and forever. Tell them that we remember our friends. She paused, and her voice grew harder. And tell them that we remember our enemies too. She closed the channel and ordered her fleet to stand down. The battle was over. 47 Hegemony ships limped out of the system. All that remained of an armada that had expected an easy victory behind them. The human fleet maintained their protective formation around Veluxi Prime. Silent sentinels watching the defeated enemy flee on the planet below. The Veluxi emerged from their shelters and stared up at the sky in disbelief. The monsters were gone. The human ships hung above them like guardian angels, their silver and blue and crimson hulls gleaming in the sunlight. Children pointed and asked their parents who had saved them, and the parents had no answers because they did not understand. What had happened? Why would humanity risk everything? For them, what had the Veluxi done to deserve such protection? Elder Yevon understood. He stood on his balcony and wept as he watched the human fleet patrol the skies. And he thought about a promise made 150 years ago by a human woman with tears on her face. I will never forget this. She had said, my people will never forget this. I swear it on my life. Humans kept their promises. That was what the galaxy was about to learn. Admiral Chung contacted the Veluxi government and requested permission to land a shuttle. She wanted to meet with Elder Yevon. Personally, she wanted to look into the eyes of the being whose kindness had saved her grandmother and tell him that the debt was paid. But in her heart, she knew that it would never truly be paid because some debts were not about balance sheets or transactions. Some debts were about gratitude and loyalty and the simple recognition that decent beings deserved to be protected from those who would destroy them. The Veluxi had been decent when decency was rare. Humanity would never forget that, and the galaxy was just beginning to understand what that meant. The news spread across known space like wildfire carried on solar winds. The Hegemony had been defeated, not just defeated but humiliated. Their third expansion armada shattered by a species that everyone had dismissed as primitives and newcomers. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy scrambled to understand what had happened. Diplomats demanded explanations from their human counterparts. Military commanders reviewed their battle plans and found them suddenly inadequate. The great powers, who had maintained careful neutrality for millennia, suddenly realized that the balance of power had shifted beneath their feet. Humanity was no longer a minor species to be ignored. They were something else entirely, and no one was quite sure what that something was. The trading posts and colony worlds and cramped ships that made up the fringes of galactic civilization. The reaction was different. The small species and the overlooked races and the forgotten peoples of the universe heard the news and felt something they had not felt in a very long time. Hope, because if humanity could defeat the hegemony, then perhaps the old order was not as unchangeable as everyone believed. Perhaps the strong did not always win. Perhaps kindness was not always a weakness. The question that echoed through every corner of known space was simple but profound. What had the Veluxi done to earn such fierce protection? Investigators dug through ancient records and forgotten archives, searching for the answer. They expected to find treaties and alliances and political agreements. They expected to discover hidden resources or strategic advantages that explained why humanity would risk war with the hegemony. What they found instead was a story about a colony ship that had broken down in the outer reach 150 years ago. A story about a merchant captain who had diverted his convoy to rescue strangers. A story about shared rations and warm beds and medicine, given freely to those who could offer nothing in return. Veluxi had not purchased an alliance. They had not brokered a treaty or offered bribes, or made promises of future payment. They had simply been kind when kindness was needed most, and humanity had remembered Elder Yevon. Received the human shuttle on a landing pad outside the capital city, surrounded by thousands of Veluxi who had gathered to witness this moment. Was old and tired and still struggling to understand how a single act of decency performed so long ago could have led to this. The shuttle's doors opened and Admiral Chun stepped out, still wearing her uniform from the battle. Her face showing the exhaustion of command and the satisfaction of victory. She was accompanied by a younger woman who bore a striking resemblance to her, clearly a daughter or perhaps a granddaughter. The crowd parted as Chun approached Elder Yevon, and the two of them stood facing each other. Representatives of two species separated by form and culture, but united by something deeper. Elder Yevon Chen said formally, "On behalf of the United Earth Confederacy and the descendants of the 12,000 souls you saved, I thank you." Yevon shook his head slowly, his large dark eyes glistening with moisture. "Admiral, I do not understand. We did only what was right. We did nothing extraordinary." Chun smiled at him, and it was a smile that held generations of gratitude within it. "That is exactly it, Elder. You did what was right when it would have been easier to do nothing. You helped us when we could not help ourselves. You asked for nothing in return." She took his gray hand in both of hers, echoing a gesture made by her grandmother so many years ago. "My people have a saying, what goes around comes around. You gave us kindness when we were small and lost and afraid. Now we are not small anymore, and we have come to repay that kindness." The younger woman stepped forward, and Chun introduced her as Ambassador Sarah Chun. Named after the captain of the original Perseverance, Ambassador Chun knelt before Elder Yevon so that her eyes were level with his. "My great-great-grandmother made you a promise," she said softly. "She told you that humanity would never forget. I am here to tell you that we have kept that promise. We have been watching over your people for 150 years, waiting for the day when you might need us as we once needed you." Elder Yevon felt tears running down his wrinkled face. "But the cost," he whispered. "The war you have started, the enemies you have made. How can we ever repay such a sacrifice?" Ambassador Chun stood and placed her hand on his shoulder. "There is no debt between us, Elder. There is only the knowledge that we did what was right." "Does that sound familiar?" Yevon stared at her, and then he began to laugh, a sound that had not escaped his throat in many years. She had quoted his own words back to him. The words he had spoken to Captain Sarah Mitchell when she had asked why he had helped strangers who could offer nothing in return. "You remembered," he said in wonder. "We remembered everything," Admiral Chun replied. "We remembered your name and your ship and your words. We taught them to our children and our grandchildren. We carved them into monuments and wrote them into our history books." She looked up at the sky where human warships still patrolled, silent guardians against any who might threaten the Veluxi again. "The galaxy believes that strength is all that matters, that kindness is a weakness to be exploited. They are wrong. Kindness is the most powerful force in the universe because it creates bonds that cannot be broken by war or time or distance." She turned back to Elder Yevon, and her voice grew harder. "But make no mistake, Elder, we remember more than kindness. We remember cruelty too, and those who have harmed our friends will learn that humanity's memory is very long indeed." Yevon looked at her and saw something in her eyes that made him shiver. Humanity was capable of great love and great gratitude, but they were also capable of great vengeance, and the hegemony was about to discover exactly what that meant. 20 years passed after the Battle of Veluxi Prime, and the galaxy was transformed. Humanity's reputation had crystallized into something that no other species had ever achieved. A perfect balance of hope and fear that made them the most fascinating and terrifying power in known space. They were not conquerors like the hegemony. They claimed no territory beyond what they needed to protect their own people and their allies. They were not merchants like the Veluxi. They had no interest in trade agreements or commercial empires. They were not crusaders or missionaries or any of the familiar types that dominated galactic politics. They were something new. They were keepers of debts. The pattern became clear over those 20 years to anyone who paid attention. Help humanity or help their allies, and they would remember. Show them kindness when kindness was costly, and they would remember that too. A minor species that had traded medical supplies to a human colony during a plague found themselves suddenly protected by human patrols when pirates threatened their shipping lanes, a neutral world that had offered shelter to human refugees. During a border conflict, discovered that humanity had quietly been funding their infrastructure development for decades. A single merchant captain who had towed a broken human ship to port received a visit from human diplomats who offered his people a full alliance and economic partnership. Every act of kindness was recorded and remembered, and eventually repaid with interest. But the opposite was also true. Those who had harmed humanity or their allies learned that human patience was not the same as human forgiveness. The hegemony discovered this lesson most painfully of all. In the years following their defeat at Veluxi Prime, rebellions spread through their conquered territories like a disease. Subject species who had accepted their fate for millennia suddenly found the courage to resist, and wherever those rebellions occurred, the rebels seemed to have access to weapons and intelligence and resources that should have been impossible to obtain. Humanity never claimed responsibility. They never issued statements or made threats or demanded credit for what was happening. But everyone knew, everyone understood that the hegemony was being dismantled piece by piece by an enemy who would never forgive and never forget. By the 20th year, the hegemony had lost half of their territory and most of their power. They were still a force to be reckoned with, but they were no longer the dominant empire of known space. They had been brought low by a species they had once dismissed as primitives, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Elder Yevon did not live to see the hegemony's final collapse, but he lived long enough to see his people flourish in ways he had never imagined possible. The Veluxi cluster was now one of the most prosperous regions in the galaxy. Protected by humanity's might and enriched by humanity's trade, Veluxi children grew up without fear of conquest or slavery. Veluxi merchants traveled the stars, knowing that no one would dare harm them, while human warships patrolled the space lanes. Veluxi culture experienced a renaissance as artists and scholars and philosophers explored questions that had been impossible to consider when survival was uncertain on his last day. Elder Yevon received one final visitor. Ambassador Sarah Chun had aged as well. Her hair gray now and her face lined with the marks of decades spent building bridges between species. She sat beside his bed and held his hand. The same hand that her namesake had held so many years ago. "Why?" Yevon asked her. His voice weak but his eyes still sharp. "Truly, why? It was such a small thing we did." Sarah smiled at him with infinite tenderness. "Because you did it when we were nobody," she said. "When helping us cost you everything and gained you nothing. You did not ask about payment or advantage. You simply saw beings in need and you helped them." She squeezed his hand gently. "That is not a small thing, Elder. That is everything. That is what separates decent beings from everyone else. That is what makes life worth living among the cold stars." Yevon closed his eyes and thought about his journey. From a young merchant captain who had stopped to help strangers to an elder statesman whose simple act of kindness had reshaped the galaxy. "I never expected anything in return," he whispered. "That is exactly why you receive so much," Sarah replied. "Because kindness given freely is the rarest gift in the universe, and humanity learned long ago that such gifts must be honored. She leaned close to him and spoke her final words. We were lost in the dark, and you found us. Mankind never overlooks a favor, and we will never stop repaying yours. Elder Yevon smiled and let himself drift away into whatever lay beyond, content in the knowledge that he had been a decent being in a universe that often rewarded cruelty. The galaxy developed new proverbs in the years that followed, taught in schools and trading posts and diplomatic academies across known space. Count your kindnesses carefully, for the humans are counting too. Be kind to strangers, for you never know who watches, and most importantly of all, the universe may be vast and cold and indifferent. But humanity is not. They remember everything, and their memory can shake worlds. The story of the perseverance and the gentle current became legend, told by parents to children on 1,000 worlds as an example of how a single act of decency could change the course of history. The Veluxi became symbols of hope, proof that being good was not the same as being weak, and humanity became something the galaxy had never seen before. Not conquerors or merchants or philosophers, but guardians, protectors of those who had proven themselves worthy through kindness, and eternal enemies of those who had proven themselves worthy of destruction through cruelty. The stars were still cold and vast and dangerous, but they were a little less lonely now, because somewhere out there, humanity was watching, and they never forgot a favor, and their retribution could shake worlds.